Listen to part of a lecture in a United States literature class. The professor is discussing realism.
Okay, everyone. In our last class, we finished up Romanticism, right? So now let's look at something completely different. Realism as a literary technique was most popular in U.S. literature from around 1860 till 1890. So it started pretty much around the time of the Civil War. And I think you'll see right away how it's different from Romanticism or any other kind of literature. There's a very specific point that makes it unique, and that is that it shows people as they are and gets you to look at them, and also, the things that need to be changed in a society. And it does it without being sentimental, not in that sort of overly emotional way, the way that romantic literature can. Realism tells it like it is. Let's look at society as a whole. In the late 1800s, people were interested in the scientific method as well as rational philosophy, which says that people can discover the truth by using reason and factual analysis. So, reason and facts, okay. And at the same time that realism was becoming popular, there were a lot of political and socio-economic changes happening in the country. There was increased literacy, plus the growth of industrialism and urbanization, growth in population from immigration, and a rise in middle-class affluence. All these factors, combined with the importance of reason and facts, meant that readers were interested in really having a good understanding of all these changes, the changes going on in society. A scholar named Amy Kaplan says, and I'm just paraphrasing here, that realism is a way to understand and deal with social change, which makes a lot of sense, I think. So then, let's take a closer look at the tricks of the trade, at how realist writers did their work. For one thing, as we said, they focus on, big surprise, reality, and in great detail. They aim for verisimilitude. Should I write that on the board?
Uh-huh.
Okay, verisimilitude means, basically, to seem true or real, like, say, a photograph rather than a painting, in a way. In fact, that's a good analogy. You see, writers tried to capture a moment in time and all its basic facts, but without exaggeration, just like a camera does. Anyway, the events, the things that happen in realist literature, are usually pretty much plausible. I mean, you figure they could probably happen to anyone. And the characters are believable too, and actually they're usually even more important than the plot. They're also, they talk the way that real people talk. Authentic speaking styles from different regions, different parts of the country were captured in the text. Does that make sense? Okay. So, besides verisimilitude, another important characteristic of realism is the narrator's objectivity. Characters and events are described without the narrators passing much judgment on them or anything, or being too dramatic. Basically, you're reading a story without too much extra comment from the narrator. Okay, now we have an idea of what realism was. So, who were the players? Well, two important realist novelists were Rebecca Harding Davis and Mark Twain. We'll talk more about other realists tomorrow, but for today, let's just start by looking briefly at these two. Rebecca Harding Davis was an author and journalist who, like other realists, was concerned about all those social changes going on. She wrote mainly about some marginalized groups of the time, like women, Native Americans, immigrants. Now, her best-known book is a novella called Life in the Iron Mills. It's really a key text because it's one of the original realist works. Her works overall have been pretty much ignored for a long time, but some critics and scholars are starting to revisit them and study them more seriously, probably more for the historical aspects of the works, and I think that's great. But if we're talking about great literature, literature that's read and enjoyed today, as something more than just a way of looking at that era, the era when it was written, well, a favorite of mine is Mark Twain. I'm sure you've read or heard of his most famous book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And Twain's style, it goes back to what I said earlier, verisimilitude, the realistic way characters act and talk. You should realize, too, that this was quite a contrast to earlier writers in the U.S. who tried to emulate British writers, tried to be very elegant at the expense of realism. You know, a lot of critics will tell you that American literature began with that book, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn.
What is the main purpose of the lecture? Listen to part of a lecture in a United States literature class. The professor is discussing realism.
Okay, everyone. In our last class, we finished up Romanticism, right? So now let's look.
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
So, in France, you have the French Academy, which was created to uphold standards of literary taste. It was a very conservative organization. It tried to keep things a certain way, resist change. It dictated that French plays should be neoclassical in form, have 5 acts, sophisticated language, etc. But try as it might, it couldn't stop change. French drama was changing, though the transition from neoclassical drama to romantic drama was itself pretty dramatic. Let's look at a play by Victor Hugo called Hernani, or as the French would say, Hernani. Although Hugo was a truly brilliant writer of essays, poems, novels, and plays, his play, Hernani, isn't a great play in and of itself. It's got a really confusing, convoluted storyline. Critics back then were unimpressed by it, though it's likely that their own feelings about how plays should be, neoclassical or romantic, affected their opinions about it. But its premiere in Paris in 1830 was anything but ordinary. Hernani's opening night was probably one of the most important literary events in 19th century France. What happened was, Hugo was a romanticist, right? He was part of a growing movement of young authors and artists who were rebelling against neoclassicism, against the conventions of neoclassicism. And what this meant is that Hugo opposed the neoclassical unities that French theater had inherited from Greek drama. These unities were basically the unity of time, space, and action, meaning that the entire play consisted of just one main event that was unfolding in just one specific place, usually in the course of one day. And Hugo found this to be too constraining. He looked for inspiration in, Hugo is from the 19th century, but he looked to Shakespeare, several centuries in the past, long before neoclassicism. For example, in Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, the play moves from indoors to outdoors, from the city to the forest and back again. So there was a kind of mobility in the use of space. And, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, the action in that play takes place on a single summer's night. But in Shakespeare's other plays, in Hamlet, for example, time elapses. People travel. They go to other destinations. And the action is not limited to one plot. Hugo also opposed the neoclassical insistence on the separation of genres. For neoclassicists, a play could only be dramatic and high art, or comic, lighthearted. And in either case, there was still a sense of decorum. Characters might make jokes and get into silly situations, but they're still regular people, like not in disguise or anything. There's still a certain amount of restraint in a neoclassical comedy. Again, earlier works by Shakespeare provided very different models that Hugo found more appealing. Many of Shakespeare's plays, even the tragedies, contain scenes with ridiculous, outlandish characters like clowns, so that many of the plays have both qualities, a serious, dramatic side and comedic scenes with the clowns that break the drama. And Hugo, like other romantics, was also opposed to the artistic rules that the neoclassicists had inherited from the Enlightenment. The romantics wanted a more passionate kind of theater, and it was more rooted in the individual and the individual sensibility. Romanticism was political as well, claiming that individuals, people, could govern themselves without the need for kings and queens. There was an ideological struggle between a lot of young people, artists, people who wanted change, and people who didn't. So, of course, Romanticism was controversial. Now, Ernani was a play that incorporated these romantic conventions. Hugo suspected that neoclassical audiences would be hostile to this new form and the ideas it represented. So, to protect himself, he rounded up his friends for opening night, and hundreds of them came to the theater that night. And Hugo writes about this arrival of the Romantics, these wild and bizarre characters and their outlandish costumes, which stupefied and infuriated the more conventional theater-goers. So the play that night took forever to finish, because it was interrupted many times, and there were these debates in the audience between Hugo's friends and supporters, the Romantics, and the neoclassicists, the supporters of the old school. Lots of interruptions, and afterward, what had been a debate inside the theater spilled out onto the street, and there were fistfights. It was a complete free-for-all, and this went on for the next 45 nights. Every night that the play was performed, there was this excitement and controversy that was really an expression of the kinds of passions that differences of aesthetics and political opinions and tastes could give rise to.
What is the lecture mainly about? Listen to part of a lecture in a children's literature class.
Today we'll start looking at the most important children's book authors of the 20th century. And I'd like to start with an author-illustrator whom some of you probably grew up reading, Dr. Seuss. His actual name was Theodore Seuss Geisel. Geisel's work was hugely popular among beginning readers and their parents, but it wasn't always considered literature or subjected to serious academic inquiry until relatively recently. In fact, not only weren't his books considered literature, but they weren't always considered good school books. In the late 1950s and even through the 60s, U.S. teachers resisted Seuss books because they perceived them as having a comic book style. Fun, maybe, but not appropriate for the classroom. None of Geisel's books individually won him a Pulitzer Prize, and he didn't receive any top children's literary awards either. Although the Pulitzer Prize Committee did give him a citation in 1984 for his special contribution over nearly half a century to the education and enjoyment of America's children and their parents. But again, that wasn't until 1984. Perhaps one reason his books weren't taken seriously is that even though they often use rhyme, you wouldn't call him a great poet. Geisel's rhyme schemes are very simple, and often, to make things rhyme, he'd use silly names for his imaginary creatures, like the Grinch and Sneetches. In fact, one book features 34 pairs of rhymed words, but only 8 of those pairs consist entirely of real words. The rest are made-up words. Geisel also illustrated his own books and created lots of highly memorable characters from a visual standpoint. Yet, as far as his artistic talent, no one's ever really called him a great artist or great illustrator. For his human characters, he pretty much drew the same face over and over. Except for minor accessories, all the people in his books look the same. Not exactly something you'd be encouraged to do in art school. And the way he drew even non-human characters was dismissed by many critics as being overly simplistic. His landscapes, on the other hand, they are simple, but they're also extremely clever. He had this uncanny knack for creating the illusion of great distance with some very simple shapes and lines. But what about from a pedagogical standpoint? Well, let's consider Geisel's most famous book, The Cat in the Hat. Now, in a way, this book, The Cat in the Hat, captures the essence of Geisel's particular genius as a children's author. Geisel actually wrote it in response to an article written in 1954 by an acclaimed novelist named John Hersey. In this article, Hersey criticized the textbooks being used in elementary schools to teach children to read. He called the books boring, contrived, and utterly humorless. After seeing Hersey's article, Geisel must have wondered what made the books so dull. And one thing he found was they used only words from the Dolch list. The Dolch list contained a few hundred common sight words like, well, cat and hat. At the time, the Dolch list was widely adhered to by publishers of textbooks for beginning readers. Well, using only words from the Dolch list, Geisel tapped into his fertile imagination, and the result was an incredibly funny and engaging storyline about a talking cat that convinces a brother and sister to let him make a huge mess in their house while their mother is away. Another character, a talking fish, tries to warn the children that they'll be blamed for the cat's crazy antics. You can really feel the tension building up in those kids as the cat makes the house messier and messier. Ultimately, the house gets straightened up in the nick of time, and the kids are left speechless when their mom shows up and casually asks if anything interesting happened in her absence. The kids, and presumably Geisel's readers, are left thinking, should they tell the truth? And that's where the book ends. Brilliant! There aren't too many authors who can set up a moral dilemma like this and then get children to think about it for themselves.
What is the lecture mainly about?
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class. The professor is discussing Henry David Thoreau.
Nowadays, trains are pretty much taken for granted, but in the United States in the first part of the 19th century, when Thoreau lived, the railroad was a big deal, a technological revolution. It was kind of earth-shattering to ride in a mechanical conveyance at 50 kilometers an hour in the 1830s. The train, or iron horse as people called it, unlocked all sorts of new experiences of time and space. Thoreau himself praised trains for changing the way people experienced their own bodies, for stirring the imagination in new ways. So, in Thoreau's famous book, Walden, as you know, Walden is one of the central literary texts of the United States from that time period. And in it, Thoreau offers both praise and criticisms of trains. Thoreau is sometimes seen as being anti-modern, but he's not. He uses poetic language, descriptive metaphors to inspire, to awe his readers, to communicate the fact that the railroad was a feat of human ingenuity. Thoreau also associates trains with commerce and trade. Though his attitudes toward commerce are complicated, he credits trains for delivering goods that feed and clothe society, things that improve human life. But Thoreau also critiques trains on what we could call philosophical grounds. He points out that riding on trains distorts people's experiences of the natural world. Trees, wildlife, landscapes just zip right past you. And this is a real problem for him. Thoreau also worries that trains had become an institution regulating a whole country. He worries about people doing things in railroad fashion, conforming to the train's timetable, letting their lives be governed by this mechanical device that's making its way into the fabric of society. And he extends this critique to other inventions of the day, like the penny press, this very fast, steam-driven press. He talks about popular literary genres like penny newspapers and dime novels, which were being published in mass quantities. He worries about people no longer thinking for themselves and uncritically accepting all this cheap popular literature and the trivial details of the news. So Thoreau is offering here a critique of technology that might be relevant for our own times, and I think it's important to take it seriously. When there's a new invention, a new computer or mobile phone technology, some new gadget, there's a tendency to think that we need to have that thing, just as people were doing in the 19th century with respect to railroads, accepting them as a necessity without considering the possible negative consequences or trade-offs that can flow from them. Okay, can anybody offer an example of what I'm talking about? Deborah?
Yeah, there was this new computer game that my brother just had to have, so he saved his money and bought it, which was good, I guess, that he saved his money and all. But now he spends like all his spare time playing that game instead of riding bikes with his friends or reading books like he used to do. And it's causing some friction between him and our parents.
Perfect example, Deborah. So this is one way to think about Thoreau's text, not just as an important book in its time for what it tells us about the 19th century, but also as a text that can teach us certain things about ourselves in contemporary society.
What does the professor mainly discuss?
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
All right, so now we've talked about folk legends and seen that one of their key features is there's usually some real history behind them. They're often about real people, so you can identify with the characters, and that's what engages us in them. The particular stories might not be true, and some of the characters or events might be made up, but there's still a sense that the story could have been true since it's about a real person. That's a distinct contrast from the other main branch of popular storytelling, which is folk tales. Folk tales are imaginative stories that, like folk legends, they've been passed down orally from storyteller to storyteller since ancient times. But with folk tales, you don't ever really get the sense that the story might have been true. They're purely imaginative and so quite revealing, I think anyway, about the culture and the connection between folk tales and the culture, which we'll talk about. But first, let's go over the various types of folk tale and focus specifically on Norwegian folk tales since they illustrate the variety pretty well. There are, in general, three main types of Norwegian folk tales. One is animal stories, where animals are the main characters. They can be wild animals or domestic, and a lot of times they can talk and behave like humans, but at the same time, they retain their animal characteristics too. They tend to involve animals like bears, wolves, and foxes. The point of these stories, their internal objective, so to speak, is usually to explain some feature of the animal, how it arose. So there's one about a fox who fools a bear into going ice fishing with his tail. When the bear puts his tail into the water through a hole in the ice to try and catch a fish, the ice freezes around it, and he ends up pulling his tail off. So that's why bears to this day have such short tails. The second category of Norwegian folktale is the supernatural. Stories about giants and dragons and trolls, and humans with supernatural powers or gifts, like invisibility cloaks, or where people are turned into animals and back again into a person. Those are called transformation stories. There's a well-known Norwegian supernatural folktale, a transformation story called East of the Sun and West of the Moon, which we'll read. It involves a prince who's a white bear by night and a human by day, and he lives in a castle that's east of the sun and west of the moon, which the heroine in the story has to try to find. Besides being a good example of a transformation story, this one also has a lot of the common things that tend to show up in folk tales. You'll find the standard opening, Once Upon a Time, and it has stock characters like a prince and a poor but beautiful peasant girl. She's the heroine I mentioned. And it has a very conventional form, so no more than two characters are involved in any one scene. And it has a happy ending. And the story is presented as though, well, even though a lot of the actions that occur are pretty fantastic, so you'd never think of it as realistic, the characters still act like they resemble real people. They're not real, or even based on historical figures, but you might have a supernatural story involving a king, and he'd act like you'd expect a Norwegian king to act. Okay, the third main kind of folktale is the comical story. We'll say more later about these, but for now, just be aware of the category and that they can contain supernatural aspects, but they're usually more playful and amusing overall than supernatural stories. Now, as I said, traditionally folktales were just passed down orally. Each generation of storytellers had their own style of telling a story. But, in Norway, before the 19th century, folktales were just for kids. They weren't seen as worthy of analysis or academic attention. But this changed when the Romantic movement spread throughout Europe in the mid-19th century. The Romantics looked at folktales as sort of a reflection of the soul of the people, so there was something distinctly Norwegian in folktales from Norway. And there was renewed pride in the literature and art forms of individual countries. As a result, the first collection of Norwegian folktales was published in 1852, and there have been many new editions published since then. For the people of Norway, these stories are now an important part of what it means to be Norwegian.
What is the lecture mainly about?